We had some polling, I think, earlier in this year. I wanted to throw this at you and get your reaction to it. We asked, how familiar, this is all Texas registered voters, how familiar are you with who sets your property taxes for your home? Only 50% said that they understood the details. 23% said that they understood the details and could explain them to others. 27% said, I'm familiar but can't explain it to other people. So even only 50% even say that they kind of understand their property taxes in general. 43% said either they had heard about the process but don't know the details, or said, I have no idea how my property taxes are set. 43%. They're all these people are paying all this money, hundreds of dollars every single month, thousands of dollars every year, and 43% can't even explain, don't even know how it all works. The second question we asked is, the elected officials who bear the most responsibility for my property tax bill are, only 50% got it right and said local elected officials. 35% said state elected officials. And 3% said federal officials. So I don't know what those guys are thinking. 12% said they didn't know. So you've got 47% that that either just don't know, or more than that. You got 50% that said they just don't know or they get it wrong. Is that part of the problem in terms of why local officials feel like with impunity they can just go out and raise everybody's taxes?
So when we look at these bonds, and James pointed out a few. We don't live in some of these areas like Rockwall ISD, or some of you do live in Hayes ISD, but the people in these communities do, and a lot of times they get their education from political action committees, and a lot of times those folks have interests at hand, right? They want to ensure passage of the bond by any means possible, and I think that's part of why we're seeing this 50-50 split in terms of like passage and failure of bonds, which in the past it's been 80% passage. Because I think folks are starting to see through some of this messaging, right? A lot of these special interests come at you and they say, hey, it's for the children. That's why you need this Taj Mahal High School Stadium. I was in East Texas a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a former candidate for school board out there. She's very engaged in the community, and she said, look, they're selling it as it's for the children. Not only that, they're actually out there pimping the kids. I was like, what do you mean? They're actually parading the kids out at these events that are paid by these PACs, getting the community involved, and telling them how to vote. Like explicitly saying, yes, you need to vote for Prop A out here. Prop A, which comes along with $2 million worth of debt. So I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this split. Folks are seeing past this kind of messaging, and in conversations over the last 2 or 3 weeks, this is an issue that's been front of mind for a lot of folks.
And it's obviously not illegal for a teacher to run out there and say, hey, somebody should support a bond, but certainly not from a ISD standpoint. It's not legal for them to do any kind of electioneering or organizing or certainly pressuring or compelling teachers or other employees to go out there and push this kind of stuff, right? I mean, we don't need to fix that. That should be in the law.
And part of that, yes. So, I mean, they're doing it in terms of like outdoor picnics, come and get some free pizza, free beer, or presentations at the actual schools where the superintendent is actually telling them about yes for Prop A. And this gets at a larger problem, right? It goes back into the profiteer stuff where these people are making money out of this. I think what we're going to see is a lot of interest, because we're seeing examples like this from across the state. People are coming forth. They're not afraid anymore. And they're coming to us. It's like, what can we do?
What you guys have been kind of talking around, which I want to put a finer point on, is that, this kind of thing, the property taxes is driven by spending. It's all driven by spending. It's borrowing the money, the hundreds of billions of dollars for bonds. It's raising taxes because they're spending too much money or spending a ton of money for God knows what. And, in looking through the books and so a lot of it's very questionable. But it's all driven by spending. And so... there have obviously over the last several legislatures, there have been attempts by the state, James, to get a handle on this. Like it's, the state does not, this is one thing we need to be clear about, talking about the education. The state does not impose a property tax. The state cannot cut your property taxes. They cannot cut your property tax rate. Like the state does not impose it. It's zero. There's no way to. It's constitutionally prohibited. But but the state talks a lot about it, James. They talk a lot about trying to lower your property taxes. So one is that are they putting themselves in a difficult position by talking about it, and yet they're not really the ones who are in control of it? And then what have they done over the last 3 or 4 sessions, and how has that, what are they trying to do to try and lower the property taxes? Because they do talk a lot about it.
Well, it's a good question. I don't fully let the legislature off the hook for property taxes, because when you consider the nature of the system, cities, counties, school districts, and the rest are extensions of state authority, right? And the legislature is fully within its rights to curtail bad behavior or impose restraints or tell them to knock it off, right? But there's not been enough of that activity yet. We have not yet reached the moment where the legislature has found it prudent to institute a local government spending limit, or serious debt restrictions, or balanced budget requirements, right? We're not there yet. I think we're moving in that direction, but thus far the legislature has been content to allow local government shenanigans to persist. And so, yes, local governments are primarily to blame, but the legislature isn't off the hook in total. Now, one of the things we did moving into the 2025 legislative session is we looked at the data. We wanted to see, look, is there actually a legitimate case to be made here that local governments are overspending, or perhaps are we imagining it? Is it just all in our minds that local governments are spending too much? And so one of the things we did is we looked at 5 large counties and 5 large cities, and we dug through their budgets to grab about 5 years worth of data and match that up with population and inflation trends in those communities. And we want to see, look, are these budgets actually growing faster than population and inflation, or again, are we imagining things?
Which, by the way, is a reasonable measure. I mean, if your population's growing, obviously you have more people, you're going to spend more. And then inflation, if things cost more, you're going to spend more. So totally reasonable to say, look, if you're staying at population and inflation increases, completely reasonable that you would need more money to pay for more people that are there, and the fact that things cost more.
Yeah. And so what we found is that of those 5 large cities, 4 of the 5 had budgets that were outpacing population and inflation. In fact, to my surprise, only the city of Houston had maintained a growth rate below that metric.
Wow.
So kudos, city of Houston.
All right.
Among the counties, over the 5-year period that we studied from 2019 to 2023, only Collin County had a budget growth rate less than population and inflation. So for the most part, 4 of the 5 counties are overspending what we as conservatives have identified as the ideal metric. So on the basis of the data, what that suggests is, yes, Texas legislature, there is evidence to suggest we do need a local spending limit. Now, you raised a point earlier. Well, what are we spending this money on? And is it going to things that we need? We don't have that level of detail yet, but I can tell you there are lots of examples, lots of instances highlighted in the newspaper every day that suggests it's not going to things that dramatically improve public service. It's going to enrich the pockets of a few, those at the very top of public service, or it's going toward rent seekers and profiteers, and it's enriching that cadre, or it's just being wasted. I can't help but again call attention to the city of Austin's new city manager, who apparently has a penchant for sweet green. He's just going out and having fancy lunches. Like, that's just blatant waste.
Yeah.
And that's rampant throughout all of your various cities and counties because, again, there is nothing really constricting how they spend or forcing them to prioritize in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, that article, and they really just did a deep dive on the credit card expenditures, right, by the city council. I mean, that's how they got that data. It's really hard to get some of this like bottom level, foundational data to understand what the city is spending all of this money on. And so, one, it's hard to even understand what they're spending the money on. But then, even then, once you find out, or maybe some of these bonds that are, that are making these Taj Mahal facilities. The question is, even if it's something like a gymnasium or a new school that needs to get built, did it need to cost $400 million? Like, what is there not a way that we could have built that same facility to have all of the necessary things it needs for the kids at at $200 million or $300 million? And so you've got those two questions, which is, one, do we even need this thing in the first place, and all of the waste and stuff that you're talking about? But even the stuff that looks like things that we need, did it need to cost that much, or are these contractors and these lobbyists and others inflating these prices? So how do we get to, you guys are deep diving on this almost every day. Is there a way, number one, can you get to the data? Can you answer those two questions, or is it really difficult? And two, if it is really difficult, is there something the state could do to get it to require more transparency, or to require, frankly, more compliance? Because that's another thing that we find is, even when we ask the right questions, they spin you around and you've left. Was this a comma or a period? And then they take 6 months to get back to you on your request. And then even if you can get the data, a lot of it's redacted because it's like these contracts that they claim are, have proprietary information or whatever. So does more need to be done to improve, Jose, transparency and accountability, even within the stuff that we can get to?
Yeah, and I think to set the stage for that, and I want to rope in James for this one. So we all agree that local spending is a problem. We need greater transparency. Yes, the state of Texas is going to continue to experience growth. That doesn't mean we need to stray away from a budget that adheres to population plus inflation. In fact, families do it every day. James, you're a father of 5. When you think about spending your family budget, are you buying the most expensive things for your kids, or do you have to make some clawbacks?
Oh my gosh, there have been so many clawbacks. We have done a lot to try and just afford groceries these days. As you can imagine, feeding 5 kids takes a lot. And so there's a lot of things we've had to rework in our own personal budget. I wish government would do just even half of what the average person has had to do to contend with the environment.
And that serves the point of, if families can do it, why aren't governments doing it? Why aren't they operating in the same fashion? If a family goes over budget, or that means maybe they don't make rent, next thing you're homeless, why can't governments don't suffer the same consequences?
Well, and here's what happens. And it happened literally 24 hours after Austin's Vader was rejected, is that you had a city council member come out and say, well, I guess we got to cut police. I guess we got to cut EMS. I guess you're just going to have to deal with all the potholes and all of the necessary essential services that you would expect a government to be covering. They, of course, immediately after they lose the vote, they gaslight the public into thinking, oh well, then I guess we can't afford police officers and the ambulance isn't going to come to your door anymore.
Well, in the same vein, are families going to cut eggs and milk so they can keep the Peloton or the Netflix subscription?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then that's the point. I mean, this is the point I was trying to make, whenever that councilwoman was doing this, is the problem with that is all the money they should have cut, the $1 million logo and the $1 million homeless mural and all that kind of stuff, all of that's been spent. So she's right in the sense that, like, they can't cut that stuff because the money's already out the door. Everything that's in front of them to cut is essential services, is the things like, that they haven't budgeted for next year, maybe 2027 or whatever. So they're looking at the big ticket items. But the reality is, if they had cut all of this waste from 2020 and 2022 and 2024, they would have, all of that stuff that we did one blog post. And I think the stuff that we pointed out was about $15 million. That's half the budget budget deficit. That was half the budget deficit that they were trying to cover with this Vader. So if they had cut all of that stuff, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, then they would have had the money. But now they're saying, oh well, all that money's out the door. We can't claw that back any. So we got to go and reduce cops.
So I want to take you back a couple of years, and then and because it relates to this point. I want to say somewhere around the 2016 or 2017 timeframe, there was a local PAC that went out and solicited signatures in an attempt to force a vote on Prop K. And Prop K at that time would have required the city to undergo a third-party efficiency audit. And this PAC actually found success. It was a fairly reasonable idea at that time to say, hey, look, let's just open up the hood, check the engine, figure out, are all the things working properly? If some things are out of whack, maybe we take a look. And what was fascinating about that whole experience is at first, then Mayor Adler and crew really didn't take offense to the issue. In fact, I think they initially embraced Prop K because it's really hard to be against transparency and efficiency. But once AFSCME and the other unions got involved, city leadership very quickly became antagonistic toward the proposition and even alleged, I think they called it a Koch-funded conspiracy, right? To get in there and figure out, like, how is Austin spending money?
Which is what every family does almost on a monthly basis.
And I mention that because I think that very same problem that was so obvious then has only metastasized, and it's gotten worse today, where you have this special group of unions, rent seekers, and profiteers getting rich off of city government services or city government contracts, and they don't want any transparency or efficiency. They don't want anybody poking around. And if you come at them with, a rejected Vader, then they're going to threaten you with the worst possible consequences to make you pay for that and never do that again.
So we know that tactic works, right? Because it scares people into supporting future tax increases down the road. But the legislature has responded to that. Governor Abbott signed into law, and the legislature passed. I think it was just in this last session, a law that forbids local governments from raising property taxes if they're not complying with the state's auditing requirements. So the states have an auditing requirement already on the books, and a new law says you can't raise taxes beyond a certain amount if you haven't done an audit on your books. Exactly what you're talking about. Like, we're trying to prevent them from using that tactic, which is, telling us, oh no, we already spent all this money, and so now we have to cut police. We say, no, you have to audit all the things you're spending money on first and be transparent about that. That way you can't make that argument that you have nowhere to cut. There were 4 cities. This is going on right now. There are 4 cities that tried to pass tax increases, or that did pass tax increases: Odessa, Lamarck, Tom Bean, and Whitesboro, that did pass tax increases without doing these audits. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is now suing them, saying that they can't go forward with their tax increases because they're in violation of this new law.